responsive to popular opinion, that government is going to be much more critical of Israel, because popular opinion in Egypt is so critical of the way Israel carries on. In fact, you can say the second most important positive development in Egypt, after it rid itself of that hideous dictator, the second most positive development is that it has acted as a deterrent on Israeli aggression against Gaza. Israel was several times in the past couple of years contemplating what it calls Operation Cast Lead 2, namely a repeat of its performance in 2008-9, but it seems to have been significantly deterred by the prospect that another attack on Gaza will result in all hell breaking loose in Egypt. And that acted, as I said, as a major restraint, a constraint on Israeli conduct. If you look at the world more broadly, it's clear that Israel's stock has dropped precipitously around the world. Every year, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, it conducts a World Service poll in which it asks a very basic question. It lists 36 countries, and it asks of these 36 countries, do you think this country has had overall a positive impact on world affairs or a negative impact on world affairs? And every year, at the bottom, 4 countries cluster as having overwhelmingly a negative impact on world affairs, judged by public opinion. And those 4 countries are always Iran, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. It's a quite remarkable fact, because of the other 3 countries, you can say the public media coverage of them is overwhelmingly negative. So you could say, leaving aside the internal makeup of the regimes, it's not altogether surprising, for example, that you would have North Korea at the bottom of the list. I dare say, leaving North Korea itself aside, there hasn't been a single positive article on North Korea in the last century. So, you're not surprising you would have North Korea at the bottom. And with all due respect to the Pakistanis in the audience, of which I think there are several, Pakistan's coverage around the world is not very favorable. But when you come to Israel, its coverage in the media ranges from very positive in places like Canada to what you might call middling in other countries in the world. But nonetheless, it's still grouped, clustered with places like Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan in the popular consciousness at this point. It's a very notable fact that even in countries where the Israel lobby is very powerful, where the Nazi Holocaust is exploited to the hilt, and where there are periodic shrieks and hysterias about a new anti-Semitism, in places that is like Canada, public opinion has drastically shifted. So in that BBC poll I read to you, and there's really no country on earth, I don't think even including the Israeli government, which is more hysterically pro-Israel than your own, meaning the Canadian government, it's a very striking fact that if you look at that BBC poll, the one I mentioned to you a moment ago, when they asked, do you think Israel has had a positive or a negative impact on world affairs, 23% of Canadians said positive, 52% said negative. There is a huge chasm between public opinion, even in Canada, between what the public feels, what the public thinks, and the way your slightly bizarre government carries on. I remember the days when people looked with great admiration at the civility of Canadian society, and I think it's rather regrettable that the body snatchers chose to invade your country. The most recent poll taken, which is indicative of where public opinion now is around the world, was in the question of Palestinian statehood that came up a few months ago. And several polls were done. And every single country in the world that was polled, every single one, bar none, in every country polled, either a plurality or a majority of those asked supported Palestinian statehood. Now, when I say every country polled, I include my own country, namely the United States. It was very surprising that even in the U.S., a plurality, 45 or 46% of Americans said, we support Palestinian statehood. And a minority between 25 and 35%, depending on the poll, said they opposed it. What makes that fact so remarkable is that the President of the United States, both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, both major political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, and the full gamut of the mainstream media, they all vehemently, one might even say stridently, opposed Palestinian statehood. But the American public managed to see through the misinformation, the disinformation, and they came out in support, at any rate a plurality in support of Palestinian statehood. And that's a very encouraging sign. It also includes, incidentally, when I talk about the falling off of support for Israel, it includes American Jews, where the polling data as well as the anecdotal information shows that more and more American Jews are distancing themselves from Israel. And the reason is not hard to find. American Jews are overwhelmingly liberal. They have been for the past century. In the last presidential election, for example, 80% of American Jews voted for Barack Obama. That was a much higher percentage than even Latinos who voted for Barack Obama. Latinos was about 63% American Jews, and an astonishing 80%. Now, when you consider that American Jews are by far and away now the richest ethno-religious group in the United States, if they were to vote by virtue of their pocketbook, which is how most people vote, they should be voting Republican, the rich person's party. But they don't. They vote Democratic. In fact, Latinos, who are among the poorest ethnic groups in the United States, vote in much higher percentages Republican than Jews do. And the reason why is Jews are liberal. And liberal basically means, in the American context, and I think also in the Canadian context, it means you believe in the rule of law. You believe in equality under the law. You believe in international organizations. You believe in the use of diplomacy rather than force to settle conflicts. That's the typical profile of a liberal. And it's nearly impossible, in fact I would say it is impossible, any longer for persons calling themselves liberal to defend the way Israel carries on. There was a time, maybe 3 decades ago, when Israel was depicted as the light unto the nations, as the oasis of civilization in the benighted and backward Arab Muslim world, where it was credible, it was believable that you can be both liberal and a supporter of Israeli policy. But that's no longer possible. And so American Jews, forced to choose between faithfulness to their liberal convictions and blind support for Israel, have chosen the first. And that's especially true of younger American Jews, college-age Jews, who are typically, they're young, they're idealistic, they're liberal, and if you're young, you're Jewish, you're idealistic, you're liberal, like many people in this room, leaving aside the Jewish, young, liberal, idealistic, you don't want to have to defend the way Israel carries on. It's 2006, July and August. Israel's at war with Lebanon. In August, the United Nations finally agrees to a ceasefire, which incidentally was consistently blocked by the Americans, Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State at the time, in order to give Israel more opportunity to wreak murder and mayhem on Lebanon. But finally a ceasefire resolution was passed. And during those last 72 hours, before the ceasefire had time to be implemented, Israel dropped 4 million cluster bomblets on South Lebanon. As Human Rights Watch put it in a report, they flooded South Lebanon with these cluster bomblets. 4 million